Sarah Wilson watched her 6-year-old son Tommy playing with fallen leaves near the Oakwood town square. Her mind drifted to her late husband's smile as she checked her watch, noting it was almost time for Tommy's therapy session. Then came the sound tires screeching on black ice, a lumber truck jackknifing across Main Street, its massive load shifting directly toward her son, who stood frozen in terror, completely unaware of the danger. 4 eternal seconds later, a blur of matted fur and protruding ribs, the skeletal German Shepherd locals called the Ghost Dog launched from between parked cars, colliding with Tommy and sending him tumbling safely into a snowbank as tons of timber crashed down precisely where he'd stood. 3 months after that February morning, Sarah sat in Dr. Reynolds' living room, watching her previously non-verbal son gently stroke the recovering dog's scarred head while whispering, "Good Shadow, brave Shadow." The first complete sentence Tommy had ever spoken when the sheriff's cruiser pulled into the driveway. And what Sheriff Harmon revealed about the dog's past made her blood run cold. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Along with the city you're watching from now, let's continue with the story. Oakwood. Montana had once thrived as a logging community, with billowing smokestacks and the constant buzz of sawmills. Now, most storefronts on Main Street sat empty, windows papered over, victims of the recession and shifting industries. Harsh winters and isolation had hardened the remaining residents, who wore their struggles like badges of honor. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and where stray animals rarely survived long. Sarah Wilson had returned to her hometown 4 years ago after her husband Mark died in a construction accident in Billings. As the head nurse at Oakwood Memorial Hospital, she commanded respect. But raising Tommy alone had proven challenging. Her son's autism meant routine doctor visits, special schooling, and countless sleepless nights when he couldn't communicate his needs. Tommy was a solemn child with sandy hair and Mark's blue eyes. While his peers chattered endlessly, Tommy observed the world in watchful silence, rarely speaking more than single words. He moved deliberately, uncomfortable with sudden changes or loud noises. Sarah learned to understand his subtle communications, a tilt of the head, a particular way of tapping his fingers, what others saw as aloofness. She recognized as her son's unique way of processing an overwhelming world. Mason Reynolds hadn't planned to stay in Oakwood. 8 years in the Army Rangers, including 3 tours in Afghanistan, had left him with nightmares, a purple heart, and a deep aversion to crowds. He'd inherited his grandfather's cabin outside town and planned to sell it. But something about the isolation appealed to his fractured soul. The town veterinarian by training, he mostly kept to himself, occasionally helping with livestock emergencies on surrounding ranches. Sheriff Buck Harmon ran Oakwood with an iron fist and little oversight. His campaign signs proclaimed "Keeping Oakwood Safe" since 2005, though many suspected his harsh enforcement targeted those who crossed him personally. His particular hatred of strays was well known. He'd implemented a controversial shoot-on-sight policy for feral dogs after claiming a pack had killed livestock. Then there was Shadow, the skeletal German Shepherd that had been spotted scavenging through dumpsters and darting between buildings for nearly 2 years. Some called it a devil dog. Others left food out only to find it untouched. No one had ever gotten close. The day Shadow saved Tommy became etched in the collective memory of Oakwood. Main Street had transformed into chaos. Within seconds, the lumber truck's horn blaring as its driver fought unsuccessfully against black ice. logs breaking free from their restraints as the vehicle jackknifed. Parents grabbed children. Pedestrians dove for cover, and Tommy Wilson stood paralyzed with fear. Nobody saw where Shadow came from. The dog had become something of a local legend, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. So emaciated, his ribs resembled barrel staves beneath his dull, patchy fur. Years of dodging rocks thrown by teenagers and Sheriff Harmon's rifle had taught him to avoid humans entirely. Yet in that critical moment, Shadow had acted with what onlookers later described as almost human purpose. He'd launched himself at Tommy with surprising speed, knocking the boy clear of danger. The price was steep. Shadow couldn't escape the cascade of tumbling logs. A horrific yelp cut through the crash. Then silence. Sarah had been across the street at the pharmacy when she heard the commotion. She'd emerged to find Tommy sitting in a snowbank, physically unharmed but staring wide-eyed at the crumpled form of the German shepherd, half buried under debris. Blood stained the snow crimson around the dog's hindquarters. "Tommy, are you hurt?" Sarah had dropped to her knees beside her son, frantically checking for injuries. Tommy, speechless as usual, had simply pointed at Shadow with tears streaming down his face. By the time volunteer firefighters secured the accident scene, a small crowd had gathered. Sheriff Harmon arrived, stepping out of his cruiser with one hand resting on his holster. "Stand back, folks," he'd commanded, approaching the injured dog. "That animal's dangerous and suffering. I'll take care of it." The meaning was clear as he unsnapped his holster. Wait. The voice belonged to Mason Reynolds, who rarely came into town except for supplies. He pushed through the onlookers. "I'm a veterinarian. Let me check him first." Sheriff Harmon's face hardened. "Doc, that's the feral that's been harassing folks. It's half dead already." "He just saved that boy's life," Mason countered, crouching carefully beside the whimpering animal. "At least let me see if he can be saved." Something in Mason's tone, perhaps the quiet authority of a man who had seen combat, made the sheriff hesitate. After an uncomfortable silence, he stepped back. "Your funeral, if it takes your hand off." Mason approached Shadow slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice. The dog's eyes, amber and surprisingly clear despite his wretched condition, followed Mason's movements. Though clearly in pain, Shadow made no attempt to snap or growl. "He's got multiple fractures and internal bleeding," Mason announced after a gentle examination, "but he could survive with proper care." Sheriff Harmon scoffed. "And who's paying for that?" "I will," Sarah found herself saying, surprising even herself. She still clutched Tommy, who hadn't taken his eyes off the dog. "He saved my son." The murmurs from the crowd grew supportive. Old Mrs. Landry from the bakery stepped forward. "I'll chip in too. That dog's a hero." Mason carefully wrapped his coat around the trembling animal. "I can treat him at my place. I've got the equipment." Sheriff Harmon's jaw tightened. "Fine. But if that animal shows any aggression, I'm putting it down myself. Town ordinance is clear about dangerous strays." As Mason gently lifted Shadow into his truck, Tommy had done something unprecedented. He'd pulled away from Sarah, approached Mason, and placed a small hand on the dog's head. "Dog," he'd said clearly, one of the few words he used regularly in the days that followed. Sarah found herself driving out to Mason's cabin daily. She told herself it was to check on Shadow's recovery and to thank Mason properly. But there was something else drawing her the way Tommy seemed magnetized to the injured animal. Shadow's condition was grave. 3 broken ribs, a shattered hind leg, internal bleeding, and years of malnutrition had left him clinging to life. Mason worked tirelessly, setting bones, administering antibiotics, coaxing nourishment into the reluctant patient. Through it all, the dog maintained a dignity that Sarah found oddly moving. "He shouldn't be alive," Mason told her on the third day. "He's survived God knows what, for years. Most strays in his condition would have given up long ago." Opinion in Oakwood remained divided. In the grocery store, Sarah overheard heated debates. Some called Shadow a hero deserving a medal. Others worried that a wild animal was being nursed back to health. Sheriff Harmon made no secret of his disapproval, stopping by Mason's property twice to check on the situation. But it was Tommy's reaction that convinced Sarah they were doing the right thing. Her silent, withdrawn son sat for hours beside Shadow's makeshift bed, sometimes reading aloud from picture books, the most sustained vocalization Sarah had ever witnessed from him. On the seventh day, when it appeared Shadow might actually recover, Sheriff Harmon arrived with an official-looking document. His message was clear once healed. The dog would be subject to the county's dangerous animal provisions. The clock was ticking. Mason Reynolds stared at the county ordinance Sheriff Harmon had left behind, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. The language was clear: any stray animal involved in an incident, regardless of circumstances, was subject to mandatory euthanasia once deemed medically stable. Sheriff Harmon had helpfully circled the relevant section in red pen. "He's given me 2 weeks," Mason told Sarah as they watched Tommy sitting cross-legged beside Shadow's bed. The boy was reading aloud from a dinosaur book, stumbling over words but trying nonetheless, something his speech therapist had been attempting unsuccessfully for years. "Can he do that?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed to avoid disturbing Tommy's rare moment of verbal practice. "Legally, yes. The ordinance exists, even if it's rarely enforced." Mason ran a hand through his graying hair. "But this doesn't make sense. Shadow saved Tommy. He's shown no aggression whatsoever." "Harmon's got some kind of vendetta." The German shepherd lay on a thick blanket beside the wood stove, his skeletal frame looking slightly less dire after a week of proper feeding. IV fluids had helped combat his severe dehydration, and the surgical repair to his hind leg appeared to be healing well, though he couldn't yet bear weight on it. Most surprising was Shadow's temperament. The allegedly wild dog accepted medical treatment with stoic patience, watching everything with intelligent amber eyes. "He's been trained," Mason observed one evening, as Shadow responded to a gentle hand command without hesitation. "And well-trained at that." Mason's suspicion was confirmed the next day when he was changing Shadow's bandages. As he cut away the old wrapping, something metallic glinted against the dog's skin. Beneath matted fur and years of grime was a half-destroyed set of military dog tags. "My God," Mason whispered, carefully cleaning the tarnished metal. The tags were damaged, partially melted, and heavily scratched, but portions remained readable Canine Shadow, and a partial service number consistent with U.S. Army Working Dogs. Mason's hands trembled slightly as he processed this discovery. He'd worked with military dogs during his tours in Afghanistan. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Shadow wasn't just any stray. He was a veteran, like Mason himself. "I need to make some calls," Mason told Sarah when she arrived with Tommy that afternoon. He showed her the tags, explaining their significance. Military working dogs don't just end up as strays. Something happened to Shadow's handler. For the first time since they'd met, Sarah saw real emotion crack through Mason's carefully maintained composure. His connection to the dog had suddenly become personal. Over the next few days, Mason worked his connections, calling old Army contacts. The information came back in pieces, each more troubling than the last. Shadow had indeed been a military working dog, specifically trained for explosive detection. His handler, Staff Sergeant David Landry, had been part of Mason's unit in Afghanistan. The name struck Mason like lightning, not just any soldier, but Mason's friend Dave, a local Oakwood boy who'd enlisted the same year as Mason. "Dave Landry was your friend?" Sarah asked when Mason shared this revelation. "Any relation to Mrs. Landry from the bakery?" "His grandmother," Mason confirmed grimly. "Dave came home about 3 years ago. After our last tour, I lost touch with him after I moved up to my grandfather's cabin." His expression darkened. "According to my contacts, Dave committed suicide 18 months ago," Sarah gasped. "And Shadow?" "Military working dogs usually stay with their handlers or get adopted by other military families. Dave must have brought Shadow home after discharge, after Dave's death." Mason trailed off, looking at the recovering dog with new understanding. Shadow must have either escaped or been abandoned. Tommy, who rarely showed interest in adult conversations, looked up sharply at Mason's words. "Shadow sad," he said clearly. "Shadow miss friend." The simple observation, coming from a child who struggled to express basic needs, left both adults momentarily speechless. Later that evening, after Sarah and Tommy had gone, Mason sat beside Shadow with a tumbler of whiskey. "I knew Dave," he told the dog quietly. "We served together. He was a good man." Shadow's ears perked up at Dave's name, confirming Mason's suspicions. The next morning, Mason drove into town with renewed purpose, heading straight for Oakwood Bakery. Mrs. Landry was in her 80s but still opened the shop daily at 5 a.m., a tradition stretching back 40 years. "I need to talk to you about Dave," Mason said without preamble, "and about his dog." Mrs. Landry's lined face seemed to age another decade. "You found Shadow," she said, not a question but a statement. She closed the bakery early that day, sitting with Mason at a corner table as she revealed the missing pieces of the puzzle. Dave had returned from Afghanistan with severe PTSD. Shadow had been his lifeline, helping him cope with nightmares and anxiety attacks. But 6 months after his return, Dave had gotten into legal trouble, a bar fight with Sheriff Harmon's son that had resulted in assault charges. "The sheriff made sure those charges stuck," Mrs. Landry explained bitterly. "Used them to torment Dave, threatening additional charges unless Dave did favors mostly looking the other way on the sheriff's side businesses." When Dave finally refused to cooperate further, Harmon had threatened to have Shadow destroyed as a dangerous animal, using the same ordnance he was currently wielding. The night Dave took his life, Shadow disappeared, Mrs. Landry concluded, tears in her rheumy eyes. "I assumed he'd run away after finding Dave, or that the sheriff had made good on his threat. I never imagined Shadow was still alive." Mason left the bakery with a cold knot of anger and clarity. Sheriff Harmon's crusade against Shadow wasn't random. It was the continuation of a personal vendetta against Dave Landry, now transferred to his loyal companion. The pieces suddenly aligned why Shadow had survived alone for so long, why he responded to military commands, why he'd risked himself to save Tommy. He wasn't just any stray, he was a highly trained service dog with a traumatic past, one that mirrored Mason's own experiences in many ways. When Mason arrived home, he found Sarah's car already in his driveway. She stepped out, looking worried. "Sheriff Harmon moved up the deadline," she said, without greeting. "He's coming for Shadow tomorrow morning." Mason paced the length of his cabin's main room, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Sarah sat at his kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Through the window, they could see Tommy sitting beside Shadow on the covered porch, the boy's small hand resting on the dog's bony shoulder. "We can't let Harmon take him," Sarah said, breaking the tense silence. "You said it yourself, he has a personal vendetta." Mason nodded grimly. Dave's grandmother confirmed it. "Harmon hounded Dave after he returned from Afghanistan, used that town ordinance as a threat. Now he's doing the same with Shadow." He paused, watching Tommy outside. "But we can't just ignore a legal order. Sarah, Harmon's the law in Oakwood, whether we like it or not." "What about appealing to the county or getting a lawyer?" Sarah suggested. "That takes time. Harmon's coming tomorrow." Mason ran a hand through his hair. "Shadow's still recovering from surgery. He can barely walk, let alone defend himself." Sarah's expression hardened with maternal determination. "Then we need to buy time." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling people. The whole town saw Shadow save Tommy. Public opinion matters in a place like Oakwood." By nightfall, Sarah's improvised phone tree had spread word throughout the small community. Shadow's military background and connection to Dave Landry, a local boy who'd gone to war, transformed the narrative from a simple stray dog story into something that touched Oakwood's patriotic core. "Ellen Perkins says she'll be here with her church group in the morning," Sarah reported, hanging up from her latest call. "The VFW Post is sending people, too." Mason looked skeptical. "You think a handful of townsfolk will stop Harmon?" "It's not just a handful," Sarah replied. "This is about more than just Shadow now. Dave was one of ours. The way Harmon treated him. People are angry." Mason didn't share her optimism. He'd seen too much of the world's darkness to believe in easy victories. After Sarah and Tommy left, he sat cleaning his grandfather's old shotgun, not as a threat, but insurance. If things went badly, he'd at least ensure Shadow had time to escape into the woods. The dog might survive on his own. He'd done it before. Morning arrived with a thin layer of frost covering the ground and the rumble of approaching vehicles. Mason stepped onto his porch, tensing at the sight of Sheriff Harmon's cruiser leading a small convoy up the dirt road to his cabin. But behind the official vehicle came something unexpected, a procession of at least 20 cars and trucks, filled with Oakwood residents. Harmon emerged from his cruiser, face darkening as he observed the growing crowd. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his holstered sidearm as Mason approached. "This doesn't concern the whole damn town. Reynolds." The sheriff growled. "Seems it does," Mason replied evenly, noting Mrs. Landry's arrival, helped from a neighbor's truck. "These people care what happens to a military hero." "It's a dog," Harmon spat. "A stray that's been causing problems for years." "He's a veteran," called out Frank Wilson from the VFW. "Just like the men and women who served this country. Just like Dave Landry." The mention of Dave's name caused a visible flinch in Harmon's otherwise composed demeanor. Mason filed the reaction away, suspecting there was more to the story than even Mrs. Landry knew. "I've got a court order," Harmon insisted. waving the document. "This animal is classified as dangerous and is to be remanded to County Animal Control." "For evaluation, not destruction," Sarah corrected, stepping forward with her own paperwork. "I had Dr. Simmons from County review the order last night. The language specifies evaluation, not euthanasia. And as a certified medical professional, I've already completed that evaluation." She handed Harmon her own document, an official-looking form with the hospital letterhead. "This is obstruction," Harmon said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "It's the law," Sarah countered. "Your law applied correctly." The standoff might have escalated further if not for an unexpected development. Tommy, who had been keeping close to his mother, suddenly broke away and walked directly to Sheriff Harmon. The crowd went silent as the usually withdrawn boy looked up at the imposing figure of authority. "Shadow good," Tommy said clearly. "Shadow saved me. Bad man hurt Shadow's friend." The simple statement, delivered in a child's innocent voice, landed like a physical blow. Harmon took an involuntary step backward, his face flushing red. "That's enough," Harmon snapped, but the damage was done. Murmurs spread through the gathered crowd, and Mason saw several people exchanging knowing looks. In small towns like Oakwood, secrets rarely stayed fully hidden. Tommy had unwittingly voiced what many had privately suspected, that Sheriff Harmon had played a role in Dave Landry's downfall. Harmon retreated to his cruiser, speaking rapidly into his radio. The confrontation had reached an uneasy stalemate, but Mason knew it wasn't over, as the crowd dispersed with promises to reconvene if needed. Mason pulled Sarah aside. "We've bought some time, but Harmon won't let this go," he warned. "I need to find out exactly what happened between him and Dave." Over the next week, Mason pieced together Dave Landry's final months through conversations with townspeople who'd previously been too afraid to speak. Dave had returned from Afghanistan with both visible and invisible wounds. Shadow had been his support animal, helping him cope with severe PTSD. But Dave had also returned with knowledge of something that had happened overseas, something that implicated someone in Harmon's family. His son Tyler was deployed in the same region, Frank Wilson explained during a private conversation at the VFW hall. Rumors were Tyler was involved in some unauthorized weapons trading. Dave knew about it. "Harmon pressured Dave to keep quiet," another veteran added. "Used his position to make Dave's life hell when he wouldn't." The picture that emerged was disturbing. Sheriff Harmon had systematically isolated and threatened Dave, using the town's legal machinery as personal weapons. When Dave finally reached his breaking point, Harmon had targeted the one thing keeping Dave's stable Shadow. Meanwhile, Shadow's recovery continued, his physical transformation remarkable under proper care. The skeletal frame began filling out as proper nutrition took effect. His dull coat regained some luster, though the scars from years on his own remained visible. Mason established a routine of physical therapy for Shadow's injured leg, and the dog responded with the discipline of his military training. Most remarkable was the connection between Shadow and Tommy. The boy, who rarely spoke to adults, maintained a constant stream of simple conversation with the dog. Sarah began bringing Tommy's speech therapist to Mason's cabin for sessions, and the improvements were unprecedented. "It's not uncommon," the therapist explained. "Some children on the spectrum connect more easily with animals than people. They're non-judgmental, consistent in their reactions." Sarah observed these sessions with mixed emotions: joy at Tommy's progress, anxiety about Shadow's uncertain future, and growing awareness of her feelings toward Mason. His gentle patience with both Tommy and Shadow revealed a depth of character she hadn't expected from the reclusive veteran. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Mason's cabin, Dr. Simmons from County Animal Services made an official visit. Her evaluation was thorough and unambiguous. Shadow showed no signs of aggression despite his traumatic history. In fact, his behavior indicated extensive service animal training. "This dog should be registered as a therapy animal," she concluded, "not designated for destruction." The report should have ended Harmon's crusade, but the sheriff remained ominously quiet, neither rescinding his order nor attempting to enforce it. Mason suspected he was planning something, and the waiting gnawed at his nerves. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Mason was at the hardware store when Tyler Harmon, the sheriff's son, approached him in the parking lot. Tyler had returned from his military service, changed quieter, and bearing his own invisible scars. "I need to talk to you about Dave," Tyler said without preamble. "And Shadow." They spoke for over an hour in Mason's truck, Tyler gradually revealing the truth. He had indeed been involved in illegal activities during deployment, activities that Dave had discovered. But the full story was more complicated. Dave had actually protected Tyler, giving him a chance to come clean rather than reporting him immediately. "Dad found out when I got home," Tyler explained, his voice hollow. "He was afraid it would ruin his reputation, his career. So he went after Dave, threatening him, pressuring him." "Why are you telling me this now?" Mason asked. Tyler's eyes reflected deep shame. "Because I watched what it did to Dave. I was too much of a coward to stop it then. But seeing that dog, hearing what happened..." He swallowed hard. "Dad's not letting this go. He's afraid if Shadow stays around, people will keep asking questions about Dave. What's he planning?" "I don't know exactly, but he mentioned something about taking care of things permanently this time." Tyler met Mason's gaze directly. "You need to be careful, and that dog needs to disappear." Mason relayed this conversation to Sarah that evening, watching her face pale with concern. "We could report this to the state police," she suggested. "With what evidence?" Mason countered. "It's Tyler's word against his father's. In the meantime, Shadow and possibly all of us would be at risk." They were discussing options when Tommy, who had been playing with Shadow in the yard, burst through the door, unusually agitated. "Shadow acting funny," he announced, tugging at his mother's sleeve. Outside, Shadow stood at rigid attention, his posture transformed from recovering patient to working military dog. His focus was fixed on the tree line at the edge of Mason's property, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Mason immediately sensed the change. "Someone's out there," he said quietly, drawing Sarah and Tommy back inside. "Call Frank from the VFW. Tell him we need help out here right away." Before Sarah could reach her phone, they heard the distinctive crack of a rifle shot. Shadow dropped instantly to a protective position, years of training overriding his still healing injuries. "Get down," Mason ordered, pulling Tommy and Sarah away from the windows. Another shot splintered the wooden frame of the front door. "Is that Harmon?" Sarah whispered, clutching Tommy protectively. "Has to be," Mason replied grimly. "He's manufacturing a situation trying to make it look like Shadow's dangerous, or that I'm harboring a violent animal." More shots followed, strategically placed to suggest an exchange of fire. Mason recognized the tactic from his military days, creating evidence of a confrontation that hadn't actually occurred. Shadow remained in a defensive posture, positioning himself between the perceived threat and Tommy. Despite the gunfire, the dog made no attempt to flee or attack further evidence of his specialized training. "We need to get word out," Mason said. "If Harmon's trying to fabricate an incident, we need witnesses." Sarah's hands trembled as she texted several people, including Mrs. Landry and Dr. Simmons. The response was immediate. Residents began mobilizing to Mason's property. For nearly an hour, they remained in lockdown, the occasional shot keeping them pinned inside. Mason used the time to document everything with his phone, creating a record of the unprovoked attack. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. In the silence that followed, they heard the approach of multiple vehicles, not just one person leaving, but several arriving. "Mason, Sarah," Frank's voice called from outside. "State police are here. You can come out." They emerged cautiously to find Harmon's cruiser abandoned at the edge of the property and a growing crowd of townspeople along with 2 state police vehicles. Tyler Harmon stood speaking with a uniformed officer, pointing toward the woods where his father had presumably fled. "Tyler called it in," Frank explained. "Said his father was planning to plant evidence and create a false narrative about a dangerous animal attack." Shadow, still in protective mode, remained close to Tommy until Mason gave the hand signal for all clear. Only then did the German Shepherd relax, though he continued scanning their surroundings with military precision. One of the state officers approached, introducing himself as Lieutenant Morrison. "We've been investigating Sheriff Harmon for several months," he explained. "Allegations of abuse of power, evidence tampering. Tyler Harmon came forward last week with information about his father's conduct." "Will they find him?" Sarah asked, still holding Tommy close. "Eventually," Morrison assured her. "A man like that can't stay hidden for long, especially in this terrain. In the meantime, we'll have officers stationed in town." As the immediate danger passed, Mason noticed Shadow's attention shift. The dog moved deliberately to Tommy's side, nudging the boy insistently and whining. "What's wrong with him?" Sarah asked, concerned. Mason observed Shadow's behavior carefully. "He's alerting to something." Tommy suddenly became very still, his eyes unfocused. Within seconds, he began trembling, the onset of a seizure that neither Sarah nor Mason had seen coming, but that Shadow had somehow detected. "Call an ambulance!" Sarah cried, easing Tommy to the ground as the seizure took hold. Throughout the episode, Shadow remained pressed against Tommy, a steady presence as the boy's body convulsed. When emergency responders arrived, the dog reluctantly allowed them to work, maintaining visual contact with Tommy at all times. "Has he had seizures before?" the paramedic asked as they stabilized Tommy. "Small ones," Sarah replied, her professional nurse's demeanor warring with maternal panic. "Nothing this severe. We're on a waiting list for testing at Children's Hospital in Missoula." As they loaded Tommy into the ambulance, Shadow attempted to follow, determined not to leave the boy's side. "Let him come," the lead paramedic decided after a moment's hesitation. "I've worked with seizure alert dogs before. If he sensed this one coming, he might be picking up on something medical equipment misses." Mason and Sarah exchanged glances of dawning realization. Shadow wasn't just a military working dog or a loyal companion. He possessed an ability that could prove life-saving for Tommy. The connection between boy and dog suddenly made profound sense. As the ambulance departed with Sarah, Tommy, and Shadow, Mason remained behind with Lieutenant Morrison, providing a formal statement about Harmon's actions. The story had grown far beyond a simple case of a stray dog. It now encompassed military trauma, police corruption, and potentially a medical breakthrough for Tommy. Word spread quickly through Oakwood, transforming public opinion definitively. The skeletal stray, once feared as a ghost dog, was being recognized as something extraordinary, a highly trained military veteran who had not only saved a child from immediate danger, but might now be saving him in a different, equally important way. 3 days after Tommy's seizure, the worst blizzard in a decade descended upon Oakwood. Wind howled through the streets, bending trees and transforming gentle snowfall into horizontal white daggers. Montana winters were never gentle, but this storm arrived with particular ferocity, as if nature itself reflected the tension gripping the small town. Mason's truck struggled against accumulating drifts as he made his way to Oakwood Memorial Hospital. The state police had established a temporary headquarters there, coordinating their ongoing search for Sheriff Harmon while simultaneously investigating years of his alleged misconduct. Mason had given his statement twice already, each retelling of Dave Landry's story and Harmon's vendetta against Shadow reopening wounds he'd long tried to ignore. The hospital waiting room had become an impromptu command center, with Lieutenant Morrison directing operations from a folding table cluttered with maps and radio equipment. Sarah, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from her shift, looked up from a conversation with a neurologist when Mason entered, stamping snow from his boots. "How's Tommy?" Mason asked, handing Sarah a cup of decent coffee he'd picked up on the way, a small kindness that had become routine. "Stable. They're monitoring him after the second seizure last night." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. "But that's not why I called you." She led Mason down the corridor to Tommy's room. Through the observation window, Mason could see the boy sleeping peacefully, medical monitors blinking steadily beside his bed. Shadow lay on a blanket on the floor beside him, a special exception to hospital policy that Dr. Wilkins, the chief administrator, had approved after witnessing the dog's remarkable behavior during Tommy's second seizure. Shadow alerted 17 minutes before any change showed on the EEG. Sarah explained. He started pacing, whining, then pressed against Tommy's side. By the time the monitors caught it, the staff was already prepared. Mason watched the German Shepherd through the glass. Though still underweight, Shadow looked dramatically different from the skeletal creature they'd rescued months ago. His vigilant posture and focused attention on Tommy spoke to both his military training and something deeper, a bond that transcended normal human-animal relationships. Dr. Marshall thinks Shadow could be detecting changes in Tommy's body chemistry. Sarah continued. Maybe scent, maybe subtle behavioral changes. She's contacted a specialist in service animals at Montana State. Wow. So, he's not just a hero once he's potentially saving Tommy's life every day, Mason observed quietly. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. The irony is, if Harmon had succeeded in having Shadow destroyed, we might never have discovered Tommy's seizure disorder until it was potentially catastrophic. A nurse approached, informing Sarah that Tommy was scheduled for another EEG. As they waited in the hallway, Lieutenant Morrison found them, his expression grim. "We've got a situation," he said without preamble. "Oakwood Elementary is evacuating due to power loss from the storm. The buses are having trouble getting through. We're mobilizing everyone with four-wheel drive to help." Sarah immediately tensed. Tommy's classmates. "They're bringing the special education class here to the hospital since it has generator backup," Morrison assured her. "That's not the immediate concern. We've got reports that not all students are accounted for." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Who's missing?" "A first grader named Ellie Thompson. Teacher thought she was with the nurse. Nurse thought she was with her regular class. By the time they realized she wasn't with either group, the first buses had already left." Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth. "Ellie has Down syndrome. She gets frightened easily in unfamiliar situations. She might have hidden somewhere." "We've got people searching the school, but with the power out and the temperature dropping—" Morrison didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the danger a 6-year-old lost in an increasingly cold building. Or worse, potentially wandering outside into the blizzard. "I'll help with the search," Mason offered immediately. His combat experience had included search and extraction operations in challenging environments. Morrison nodded gratefully. "We need every trained person we can get. The State Highway Department says this storm is intensifying. We've got maybe 2 hours before conditions become impossible even for emergency vehicles." As they prepared to depart, a commotion erupted from Tommy's room. A nurse rushed out, calling for assistance. "The dog's going crazy." They hurried back to find Shadow frantically pawing at the door, his entire demeanor transformed from calm watchfulness to urgent agitation. Tommy, now awake, appeared confused by his companion's behavior. "He wants out," Tommy said simply. "Shadow knows something." Mason knelt beside the distressed dog, recognizing a behavior pattern he'd seen in military working dogs. "This isn't a seizure alert. He's detecting something else." Shadow continued his urgent communication, looking between Mason and the door, then back at Tommy. Could he know about the missing girl? Sarah wondered. Mason considered the possibility. Military dogs like Shadow were trained to respond to human distress, to track and locate targets. It's possible. These dogs are intuitive beyond their training sometimes. A wild, desperate plan began forming in Mason's mind. "Let me take Shadow to the school. His tracking abilities might be exactly what we need in these conditions." The medical staff initially objected, concerned about removing Shadow from Tommy's side. But when the dog's agitation only increased, even Tommy advocated for the plan. "Shadow helped find lost girl," he insisted with unusual clarity. "Then come back." 20 minutes later, Morrison, Mason, and Shadow were in a state police SUV, fighting their way through streets rapidly disappearing under snowdrifts. The elementary school loomed dark and silent, emergency vehicles surrounding it with flashing lights that created eerie patterns in the swirling snow. Inside, the search teams had already covered most of the building systematically, calling Ellie's name into increasingly cold classrooms and corridors. The temperature inside had dropped dangerously, the heating system incapacitated by the power outage. Mason released Shadow from his makeshift leash, kneeling to address him directly. "Find," he commanded, using the search directive he'd seen military handlers use. "Find girl." For a moment, Shadow stared at him, head cocked in concentration. Then, with sudden purpose, the dog began moving through the darkened hallway, nose working methodically. Mason and Morrison followed, flashlight beams bobbing as they navigated around abandoned backpacks and artwork torn from walls by the evacuation. Shadow led them not further into the school, but toward a rear exit. Outside, conditions had deteriorated significantly, visibility reduced to mere feet. The dog paused at the door, looking back at Mason as if confirming his decision to proceed. "You think she went outside?" Morrison asked incredulously. "In this." Mason watched Shadow's determined posture. He's picking up something. We have to trust him. They pushed through into the storm's full fury, immediately buffeted by winds that stole breath and orientation. Shadow forged ahead, periodically disappearing into white nothingness before materializing again, checking to ensure they followed. "The old playground equipment is back here," Morrison shouted over the wind. "It was scheduled for demolition next spring." Shadow led them to a dilapidated wooden play structure, a tunnel-like construction partially protected from direct snowfall. The dog stopped, pawing insistently at a small opening nearly obscured by drifting snow. Mason dropped to his knees. Shining his flashlight into the space, two terrified eyes reflected back Ellie Thompson had indeed sought shelter in the familiar playground structure where she often spent recess. "Ellie, we're here to help you," Mason called, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Can you come out?" The girl shook her head, retreating further into her hiding place. Shadow whined, sensing the impasse. "She's scared of strangers," Morrison remembered. "That's why she probably hid in the first place." Mason's tactical mind assessed the situation rapidly. The temperature was dropping by the minute. The entrance was too small for either man to enter without potentially terrifying the girl further. Every passing moment increased the danger of hypothermia. Then Shadow took the initiative, gently pushing past Mason. The dog crawled into the wooden tunnel, his body language deliberately non-threatening. They heard soft whimpering from Ellie. Then, surprisingly, a child's gentle laugh. "Doggy!" Her voice drifted out, barely audible above the storm. For 5 agonizing minutes, Mason and Morrison waited, unable to see what was happening inside the structure. Then, miracle of miracles, Shadow backed out slowly, and clutching his collar with mittened hands, Ellie followed. The girl was dangerously cold, her lips tinged blue, but conscious and moving. Morrison immediately radioed for medical support while Mason wrapped her in his coat. Shadow positioned himself against Ellie's side, providing additional warmth from his own body. The journey back to the building seemed eternal, each step a battle against nature's fury. Shadow remained glued to Ellie's side as Morrison carried her, the dog seemingly understanding that his continued presence was keeping the frightened child calm. Inside, emergency medical technicians immediately took over, wrapping Ellie in thermal blankets and preparing to transport her to the hospital. When they tried to separate Shadow from her, the girl became distraught. "Doggy, stay," she pleaded, reaching for the German Shepherd. The lead EMT assessed the situation pragmatically. "The dog can come in the ambulance. He's apparently the reason we found her at all." As they loaded both child and dog into the waiting ambulance, Mason caught Shadow's gaze. The animal's focus and determination throughout the rescue had been nothing short of extraordinary further evidence of his specialized training and intelligence. Morrison clapped a hand on Mason's shoulder. "I've been in law enforcement 15 years and never seen anything like this. That dog is something special." "He always was," Mason replied quietly. "It just took the right circumstances for everyone to see it." By the time they reached the hospital, Oakwood had effectively shut down under the blizzard's assault. Power was out across most of the town, with only the hospital's generators maintaining essential services. Roads were impassable, communications sporadic. Those who had made it to the hospital staff, patients, search teams, and evacuated school children found themselves effectively sheltering in place for the duration. Ellie's parents, who had been desperately waiting in the emergency room, broke down in grateful tears when their daughter arrived. The story of her rescue spread rapidly through the hospital, Shadow's role growing with each retelling. By evening, the once feared ghost dog had become a certified hero twice over. Mason found Sarah in Tommy's room, where both mother and son were watching the storm through frosted windows. Shadow, having been examined, fed, and cleared by the medical staff after the rescue, had returned to his post beside Tommy's bed as if he'd never left. "He knew," Tommy said as Mason entered, reaching to pat Shadow's head. Shadow knew the girl was lost. "That's right," Mason confirmed, still processing the extraordinary events himself. "He led us right to her. Without him, in these conditions." He left the sentence unfinished, unwilling to voice the likely tragic outcome. Sarah moved to stand beside Mason, her shoulder touching his in a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them. The neurologist said what Shadow did today, switching from monitoring Tommy to alerting about another child in danger, suggests his abilities go beyond basic training. It's like he's making conscious choices about who needs him most urgently. "Military dogs are trained to assess threats and priorities," Mason explained, though even to his ears it sounded insufficient to explain Shadow's behavior. "But this goes beyond that. It's like he's keeping a promise," Sarah finished softly. "To Dave, maybe. To continue the work they started together." Outside, the blizzard reached its peak ferocity, effectively cutting Oakwood off from the outside world. But within the hospital walls, something remarkable was happening. A community was reorganizing its understanding of a creature they had once feared, and in doing so, re-examining other prejudices and assumptions. As night fell and the hospital settled into emergency protocols, an unexpected radio transmission broke through the static. Sheriff Harmon's cruiser had been found abandoned in a ditch 10 miles outside town. The man himself was missing, presumably on foot in the worst blizzard in recent memory. Morrison delivered this news to Mason privately. "Search and rescue can't deploy in these conditions. If he's out there on foot..." The lieutenant's expression was grim. "No one could survive this. Not without shelter." Mason nodded, understanding the implication. Nature might accomplish what justice had not yet had the opportunity to address. Part of him, the part still raw from learning how Harmon had hounded Dave to his death, how he'd tried to kill Shadow, how he'd threatened everyone Mason had come to care about, felt a cold satisfaction. But another part recognized the hollow emptiness of such an end. As the hospital settled into an uneasy night, with families camped in waiting rooms and corridors, Mason found himself standing watch beside 2 beds, Tommy's official one, and the makeshift cot where Ellie Thompson rested, her parents sleeping awkwardly in nearby chairs. Shadow moved between the 2 children periodically, checking each with careful attention before settling back into his vigilant posture. Through the window, Mason could see nothing but swirling white darkness, a storm that isolated them completely from outside help, leaving them dependent on each other's resources and character. Somewhere in that same darkness, Harmon faced his own reckoning, alone with the consequences of his actions in a way that perhaps no court could have arranged. The symmetry wasn't lost on Mason. Shadow, once abandoned and feared, had become the community's unexpected guardian. And Harmon, once its official protector, had become the isolated outcast facing nature's harsh judgment. By morning, The blizzard had transformed Oakwood into an alien landscape of towering drifts and buried vehicles. The hospital stood as an island of warmth and light, its generators humming steadily while the rest of the town remained dark. Inside, an impromptu community had formed medical staff, stranded families, search teams, and the children evacuated from the elementary school, all sharing limited resources with surprising generosity. Mason woke stiff and disoriented from his makeshift bed, a hospital waiting room chair that had served as his resting place for a few fitful hours. Shadow was already alert, making his rounds between Tommy and Ellie with the methodical precision of a trained nurse. The news about Sheriff Harmon spread through the hospital in hushed conversations. The storm had made any search impossible, and after 20 hours exposed to temperatures well below zero, few held hope for his survival. Mason found himself troubled by his own complex emotions, relief mingled with an unexpected hollowness. Harmon's death would bring no real justice for Dave, no true answers for the town. Lieutenant Morrison gathered the available search and rescue personnel in the hospital cafeteria, spreading maps across tables still dotted with coffee cups and breakfast trays. "Once visibility improves, we'll organize teams to check these sectors," he explained, indicating areas where a man on foot might have sought shelter. No one spoke the obvious. They were likely organizing a recovery mission, not a rescue. Sarah found Mason as the meeting dispersed. Her professional composure showed cracks after the long night hair escaping her usual neat ponytail, dark circles beneath her eyes. Yet there was strength in her bearing, the resilience of someone accustomed to medical crises. "Tommy had another seizure at 4 a.m., she said without preamble. "Shadow alerted exactly 12 minutes before the EEG showed any change." "Is he okay?" Mason asked, immediately concerned. "Tommy's fine. The staff was prepared thanks to Shadow." She hesitated before continuing, her voice dropping. "Dr. Marshall wants to formally study Shadow's abilities. She believes he could revolutionize how we manage epilepsy in children." Mason nodded slowly, processing the implications. That would mean tests, probably travel to medical centers, specialists. It would mean Shadow becoming recognized for what he truly is, extraordinary. Sarah's expression softened. But it would also mean decisions about his future, his ownership. The question hung between them. Shadow had no official owner. Dave was gone, and despite Mason's care these past months, no legal claim had been established. The military had shown no interest in reclaiming a dog they'd presumably written off years ago. "He belongs with Tommy," Mason said finally. "Anyone with eyes can see that." Sarah's relief was visible. "Thank you. I was hoping you'd say that. But Mason," she placed a hand on his arm, "that doesn't mean you wouldn't still be part of his life, part of our lives." And the weight of her words settled between them, an acknowledgment of something neither had directly addressed, the quiet, steady connection that had formed amidst crisis. Before Mason could respond, commotion erupted from the hospital entrance. A search team had returned, bringing not Sheriff Harmon, but Tyler Harmon, his son, who had apparently gone searching for his father despite the dangerous conditions. Tyler's face was wind-burned, his expression haunted as medical staff treated him for mild hypothermia. "I found his tracks," Tyler explained hoarsely to Morrison. "He was heading for the old hunting cabin at Blackwater Ridge. He's got supplies cached there, guns, food. He told me once it was his insurance policy if things ever went bad." The revelation sent a ripple of concern through the gathered personnel. Harmon, alive and armed, presented a very different scenario than Harmon succumbing to the elements. "That cabin's completely isolated," Morrison noted grimly. "With provisions. He could hold out for weeks until the road's clear. By then, he could be anywhere." Mason felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Harmon wouldn't simply disappear. A man with his vendetta, his pride, wouldn't accept defeat so easily. He would return for revenge against those who had exposed him, against Shadow, against Mason himself. The day progressed with restless tension. Hospital staff continued caring for patients while simultaneously managing the needs of those sheltering from the storm. Children played improvised games in corridors. Volunteers organized meal distribution from dwindling cafeteria supplies. Through it all, Shadow maintained his vigilant routine, dividing his attention between Tommy and Ellie with occasional circuits to check other children. Late afternoon brought a break in the weather, not an end to the storm, but a temporary lull that allowed limited visibility beyond the hospital windows. Mason stood watching snowplows begin the impossible task of clearing main roads when Sarah joined him, her expression troubled. "Tommy's asking to go home," she said quietly. "He's getting agitated, saying Shadow needs to check the house." Mason frowned. "That's not safe yet. The roads—" "I know," Sarah interrupted. "I've explained that. But he's insistent in a way I've never seen before. Says Shadow told him it's important." Mason studied the German shepherd, who had taken up position beside Tommy's bed. The dog's posture seemed unusually alert. His attention focused not on the boy, but on the door. Ears pricked forward in concentration. "Shadow's picking up on something," Mason realized. Just like with Ellie during the evacuation. Sarah's face paled. "You don't think—" She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear. Harmon might have made his way not to the hunting cabin, but to Sarah's house, a more direct avenue for revenge. "It's probably nothing," Mason said, trying to sound more certain than he felt. "But I should check it out once the plows clear a path." By evening, the main roads had been partially cleared, enough for emergency vehicles to navigate with caution. Mason borrowed a hospital security guard's truck, promising Sarah he would simply drive by her house, verify all was secure, and return immediately. The drive through Oakwood's transformed streets was eerie, familiar landmarks rendered strange under mountains of snow, abandoned vehicles creating ghostly silhouettes in his headlights. Sarah's modest two-story home on Maple Street appeared untouched, dark like the rest of the neighborhood without power. Mason approached cautiously, years of military training making him acutely sensitive to anything out of place. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The front door remained locked, windows intact. But as he circled to the back of the house, he noticed footprints partially filled with fresh snow leading to the cellar entrance. The padlock hung broken. Inside his pocket, the radio Morrison had given him crackled with static. He should call for backup, wait for proper law enforcement. That would be the prudent course. But if Harmon was indeed inside, establishing a position in Sarah's home, Tommy's home, the delay could prove devastating. Mason made his decision. With deliberate quiet, he eased the cellar door open and descended into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight revealing Tommy's bicycle stored for winter, boxes of Christmas decorations, the normal accumulated life of a family. And sitting on an old wooden chair beside the furnace, rifle balanced across his knees, waited Sheriff Buck Harmon. Figured someone would check eventually. Harmon said, his voice raspy with cold and exhaustion. "Hoped it'd be you. Reynolds." The sheriff looked half frozen, his face weathered by exposure, but his hands remained steady on the rifle. His eyes held something worse than hatred, the empty resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. "It's over. Harmon," Mason said evenly, keeping his flashlight beam deliberately away from the sheriff's face to avoid antagonizing him. "Tyler told everyone about the cabin. State police are already looking for you." "Tyler," Harmon repeated, a flicker of emotion pain, perhaps crossing his features. "Always was soft, like his mother. Never understood what it takes to maintain respect in a place like this." "Respect," Mason echoed. "Is that what you call what you did to Dave Landry? To his dog?" Harmon's expression hardened. "Landry was weak. Came back from war crying about nightmares, about things he'd seen, things my boy was involved in. Threatened to report it, to ruin Tyler's future, my family's name." "So you tormented him until he took his own life?" "I gave him choices. He made the wrong ones." Harmon adjusted his grip on the rifle, the barrel shifting slightly toward Mason. "Just like you're doing now." Mason maintained eye contact with Harmon, acutely aware of the rifle's barrel now pointed in his direction. Years of combat experience had taught him to recognize the look in the sheriff's eyes, the dangerous calm of a man who had already decided on violence. "This doesn't end well for you," Mason said evenly. "The state police know everything about Dave, about your harassment, about the shots fired at my property." Harmon's laugh was hollow. "You think I care about that now? My career's over. My reputation's destroyed. My own son turned against me." His weathered face hardened. "But I'm not going down alone. That dog should have died years ago after Landry. Now it's found another weak fool to protect. Tommy Wilson is a 6-year-old boy," Mason countered, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "A child shadow saved from being crushed. Collateral damage." Harmon shrugged. "That mutt made me look like a fool in front of the whole town." "And you," his eyes narrowed, "you had to keep pushing, digging up the past." Mason recognized the immediate danger. Harmon hadn't come to Sarah's house randomly. He'd chosen it deliberately as a place to make his final stand, to extract vengeance against those he blamed for his downfall. In his distorted thinking, Shadow represented the linchpin that had unraveled everything, the connection to Dave Landry, to Mason's investigation, to the community turning against him. "You're not thinking clearly," Mason said, trying a different approach. "You've been in the cold too long. Let's get you to the hospital. Get warmed up, then sort this out properly." Harmon's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "Always the negotiator. Weren't you the reasonable one? That's why Landry trusted you instead of his commanding officer. Why he wrote to you about what he and Tyler had seen overseas." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Dave had written to him Mason had received no such letter, had heard nothing from his friend after their respective discharges. "What letter?" Mason demanded. "The one that never reached you." Harmon smiled thinly. "Being sheriff has its advantages. Postal inspections for suspected contraband, for instance." Understanding dawned cold and clear. Harmon had intercepted Dave's attempt to reach out, to perhaps share the burden of whatever he'd witnessed. Dave had sought help from the one person he trusted, and that lifeline had been deliberately cut. "You son of a bitch," Mason breathed. He might still be alive if that letter had reached me. He was weak, Harmon repeated, as if this explained everything. The dog made him weak, coddling him through his so-called PTSD. Now it's doing the same to the Wilson boy. A noise upstairs interrupted them, the subtle creak of the front door opening. Harmon's head snapped up, rifle immediately redirecting toward the ceiling. "Expecting company," he hissed. "Who else knows I'm here?" Mason's blood ran cold. No one should be coming to the house. Morrison believed he was simply checking the property before returning to the hospital. Unless... Mason. Sarah's voice filtered down from the first floor. "Are you down there? Tommy was so upset I had to bring him home to check." Panic surged through Mason's chest. Sarah and Tommy were walking into an ambush. Worse. Shadow was likely with them, the very target of Harmon's vendetta. "Get out!" Mason shouted. "Harmon's here. He's armed." Everything happened at once. Harmon lunged to his feet, shoving past Mason toward the cellar stairs. Mason grabbed for him, catching his jacket but losing his balance on the icy concrete floor. The sheriff broke free, rifle raised as he took the stairs 2 at a time. Mason scrambled up behind him, desperate to reach Sarah and Tommy before Harmon could. He emerged into the kitchen in time to see Harmon advancing toward the front hallway, where Sarah stood frozen in shock, Tommy partially hidden behind her legs. Shadow stood before them, his body rigid, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest. "Well, Harmon said, training his rifle on the German Shepherd. "The gang's all here. Fitting that the mutt goes first." "Buck, please," Sarah pleaded, maternal instinct overriding fear as she pushed Tommy further behind her. "He's just a dog. He's helping my son. He's the reason for all of this," Harmon countered, his voice eerily calm. "Him and Landry and their damaged soldier routine, turning my boy against me, turning the whole town." Mason edged sideways, trying to position himself between Harmon and the others without provoking immediate violence. "This is between you and me, Buck. Let them go, and we can settle this." Harmon laughed again, that same hollow sound. "Noble to the end. Just like Dave thought he was being noble." He adjusted his aim, centering on Shadow, who had not retreated an inch despite the obvious threat. Good riddance to bad rubbish. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Harmon's finger tightened on the trigger, Tommy broke free from his mother's protective stance, darting forward with a child's impulsive courage. "No!" the boy shouted, moving to stand beside Shadow. "Bad man! Don't hurt Shadow!" Sarah lunged for her son. Mason launched himself toward Harmon. Shadow, recognizing the imminent threat to Tommy, did what military dogs are trained to do when their handlers are threatened. He attacked. The rifle discharged with a deafening crack in the enclosed space. Shadow's powerful body collided with Harmon's, driving him backward. Man and dog went down in a tangle of limbs and snarls, the rifle clattering across the hardwood floor. Mason reached them seconds later, hauling Shadow back by his collar while simultaneously delivering a decisive blow to Harmon's jaw. The sheriff went limp, the fight draining from him as blood spread across his jacket, not from Shadow's teeth, but from a wound in his shoulder where his own rifle shot had caught him during the struggle. "Tommy, are you hurt?" Sarah's frantic voice cut through the chaos. "Mason." "We're okay," Mason assured her, quickly securing Harmon with his own handcuffs, which the sheriff still carried on his belt. "Call Morrison. Tell him we need police and an ambulance." Only then did Mason notice Shadow whining softly, limping as he returned to Tommy's side. The dog's left foreleg showed a streak of red, a graze from the rifle shot. Despite his injury, Shadow pressed protectively against Tommy, who had begun crying in delayed reaction to the violence. Within 20 minutes, the house filled with state police officers, emergency medical technicians, and a visibly shaken Lieutenant Morrison. As paramedics treated Harmon's shoulder wound before transport, Morrison pulled Mason aside. "You should have waited for backup," he admonished, though his tone carried no real anger. "He could have killed all of you." "Shadow knew," Mason replied simply. "That's why Tommy was so insistent on coming home. The dog sensed Harmon was here." Morrison shook his head in amazement. "That animal! I've never seen anything like him, military trained or not. His instincts go beyond explanation." A veterinary technician who had accompanied the emergency responders examined Shadow's wound, pronouncing it minor, a surface graze that required cleaning but no stitches. Throughout the examination, the German Shepherd remained positioned where he could maintain visual contact with Tommy, who refused to leave his side. "You know what this means," Morrison said quietly as they watched Harmon being loaded into an ambulance, wrists secured to the gurney rails. "With attempted murder charges on top of everything else, he'll never see the outside of a prison again. Justice, of a sort." Yet Mason felt no satisfaction, only a profound weariness. Dave was still gone. The damage Harmon had inflicted on his town and family couldn't be undone. Only the living remained to pick up the pieces. Sarah approached, wrapping a blanket more securely around Tommy's shoulders. "They want us all to go to the hospital for evaluation," she said. "Standard procedure after a traumatic incident, especially with Tommy's condition." Mason nodded. "I'll follow in the truck. They'll need my statement anyway." Sarah caught his arm, her eyes meeting his with unexpected intensity. "You saved our lives. All of us." "Shadow did," Mason corrected gently. "I just followed his lead." "Like Dave would have wanted," she whispered. The name hung in the air between them, no longer a ghost, but a connection, a reason their paths had crossed in the first place. Dave's loyalty to his dog, his attempt to reach out to Mason, even Harmon's twisted vendetta, all threads woven into the unlikely tapestry that had brought them to this moment. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Marshall arrived, having heard about the incident through Oakwood's efficient grapevine of emergency responders. She immediately focused on Shadow, who was allowing a now calmer Tommy to examine his bandaged leg. "This confirms everything I suspected," she said after Mason briefed her on Shadow's role in detecting Harmon's presence. "His ability to sense danger isn't just medical, it's comprehensive. I've consulted with colleagues at the veterinary school. If his ability to detect seizures proves consistent, he represents an extraordinary case study." "What does that mean for Tommy?" Sarah asked, her nurse's pragmatism reasserting itself through the emotional aftermath. "It means your son may have found the most effective seizure-alert dog I've ever encountered," Dr. Marshall replied, "and we need to make it official." As the police completed their work, Morrison returned with unexpected news. "We found something you should see," he told Mason, leading him to the small home office where Sarah kept household files and Tommy's medical records. On the desk lay a weathered envelope, unsealed and empty, with Mason's grandfather's address and a military APO return address. Dave Landry's intercepted letter. "Harmon must have brought it as some kind of twisted evidence," Morrison suggested. "The contents are gone, but the envelope confirms your story about intercepted mail." Mason stared at the faded handwriting, Dave's distinctive slanted script. More evidence for the case against Harmon? Certainly. But also a tangible reminder of what could have been different if that letter had reached its destination. Later, as they prepared to depart for the hospital, Mason found Tommy sitting on the front steps with Shadow, the boy's small arm draped protectively around the dog's neck. Despite everything that had happened, both appeared remarkably calm in each other's presence. "Shadow knew the bad man was here," Tommy said without looking up as Mason approached. "He told me. He's a special dog," Mason agreed, sitting beside them. "He's not just a dog," Tommy corrected with a child's certainty. "He's my friend, and he was his friend, too." The boy pointed to a photograph on the wall inside Sarah's husband, Mark Wilson, in his National Guard uniform. Mason looked more closely at the photo he'd seen dozens of times before, but never truly examined. There in the background, barely visible among a group of deploying soldiers, stood a younger Dave Landry. "They knew each other?" Mason asked, stunned by the connection. Tommy nodded solemnly. "Daddy and Shadow's first daddy were friends. Shadow remembers." The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. Not random chance, but something more deliberate had brought Shadow into Tommy's life that day on Main Street. Whether guided by training, instinct, or something deeper, the dog had recognized his former handler's friend's son and acted to protect him. Spring came late to Oakwood. As it always did in northern Montana, April's tentative warmth finally coaxed reluctant crocuses from the thawing earth around Sarah Wilson's front porch. 4 months had passed since the blizzard, and Sheriff Harmon's desperate last stand, 4 months of healing, adjustment, and quiet transformation for the small town and its residents. Mason stood watching Tommy and Shadow in the backyard, the boy tossing a tennis ball with the focused determination of a child at play, the German shepherd retrieving it with the calculated restraint of an animal who understood his own strength. Shadow looked like a different creature now, his once skeletal frame filled out with proper nutrition, his coat thick and lustrous where patchy fur had once barely covered scars. Only his eyes remained unchanged, amber and watchful, missing nothing. "Coffee!" Sarah appeared beside Mason, offering a steaming mug. Her free hand came to rest lightly on his arm, a casual touch that had become familiar over these past months. "Thanks," he accepted gratefully, the morning chill still sharp enough to make hot coffee welcome. "Tommy's getting better at his throwing." Sarah smiled, watching her son. "Physical therapy twice a week is helping with his coordination. Dr. Klein says he's making remarkable progress." She hesitated before adding, "She also says a lot of it is psychological. His confidence is growing because of Shadow." The bond between boy and dog had deepened into something specialists now documented in medical journals. Shadow's ability to detect Tommy's seizures had proven remarkably consistent, alerting between 15 and 20 minutes before any change registered on medical equipment. But beyond this measurable talent lay something equally valuable. The emotional connection had drawn Tommy out of his shell, providing both security and motivation to communicate. "The hearing's tomorrow," Sarah said, changing the subject. "Are you nervous?" Mason considered the question. Tomorrow would mark the official county hearing to determine Shadow's legal status, a formality most believed, but one with significant implications. "Not nervous," he replied, "just ready for it to be settled." The legal proceedings had been complex. As a former military working dog, Shadow technically remained government property, though the Army had shown no interest in reclaiming a dog they'd written off years earlier. Harmon's arrest and the subsequent investigation had uncovered documentation showing how the sheriff had deliberately obstructed Dave Landry's attempts to formally adopt Shadow after their discharge, part of his systematic campaign of harassment. Now, with recommendations from medical professionals, veterans advocacy groups, and the state police, the county was prepared to officially designate Shadow as a service animal and approve his permanent placement with the Wilson family. Mason had been instrumental in navigating the bureaucracy, leveraging his own military connections to expedite the process. "I stopped by Mrs. Landry's yesterday," Sarah mentioned. "She's baking cookies for the hearing. Says the entire town council wouldn't dare vote against Shadow with her sitting in the front row." Mason chuckled. "Smart money's on Mrs. Landry in that standoff." The mention of Dave's grandmother brought a familiar ache, not as sharp as it once had been, but present nonetheless. The discovery of the connection between Dave, Mark Wilson, and by extension Tommy had shifted Mason's understanding of everything that had transpired. It wasn't merely coincidence that had brought Shadow into their lives, but a complex web of relationships and loyalties extending back years. Mark Wilson and Dave Landry had served together briefly before Mark's unit was reassigned. They'd maintained a friendship through occasional correspondence, enough that Dave had recognized Tommy from photos when the boy was still a toddler. After Mark's death and Dave's subsequent struggles, it wasn't surprising that Shadow might have recognized Tommy that fateful day on Main Street. Military dogs were trained to remember faces, scents, patterns. "Have you decided about the job offer?" Sarah asked, interrupting his thoughts. Mason nodded slowly. "I think I have." The state police had approached him 6 weeks earlier about establishing a K-9 training program in Missoula, specifically focused on service dogs for veterans and children with medical conditions. Lieutenant Morrison had recommended Mason personally, citing his military background and his work with Shadow as unique qualifications. "I'm going to take it," he said finally. "It feels right, using what I've learned from Shadow to help others." Sarah's smile warmed him more than the coffee. "Tommy will miss having you next door, but Missoula's only 3 hours away." "About that," Mason began, then hesitated, suddenly unsure of his prepared words. 4 months of gradually spending more time together, of shared dinners and quiet conversations after Tommy was asleep, had built something between them neither had explicitly defined. "I was thinking maybe we could look at houses with enough yard for Shadow to run. Places big enough for 3. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, her coffee mug suspended halfway to her lips. "Mason Reynolds, are you asking us to move to Missoula with you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it," he clarified, suddenly feeling as awkward as a teenager. "Tommy's doctors have all said the children's hospital there would be better for his ongoing treatment. And you mentioned the nursing supervisor position that opened at St. Patrick's." "And us?" Sarah asked softly. "What about us in this plan?" Mason set his coffee down carefully on the porch railing. "I think you know how I feel about you, Sarah, about both of you. These past months." He gestured helplessly, words inadequate for the gradual, steady certainty that had grown within him. "I don't want to be 3 hours away. I want to be wherever you are." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We should talk to Tommy, see how he feels about it. Before Mason could respond, Shadow's distinctive alert bark drew their attention. The dog had stopped playing and stood at rigid attention, staring toward the front of the house. "Someone's here," Mason said, recognizing the behavior pattern. Moments later, a familiar truck pulled into the driveway, Tyler Harmon's vehicle. Since his father's arrest, Tyler had maintained a low profile in Oakwood, quietly cooperating with investigators while attempting to rebuild his life amidst the wreckage of his family's reputation. "Should I talk to him?" Sarah asked, a hint of protective concern in her voice. "Let me," Mason replied, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze before heading around the side of the house. Tyler stood awkwardly beside his truck, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Though only in his early 30s, grief and stress had aged him visibly in recent months. He nodded at Mason's approach, his expression guarded. "Tyler," Mason acknowledged. "What brings you by? Heard about the hearing tomorrow?" Tyler replied. "Wanted to drop this off." He reached into his truck and retrieved a worn manila envelope. "Found it when I was cleaning out Dad's house. Thought you should have it." Mason accepted the envelope with a questioning look. Tyler offered a strained smile. "It's Dave's letter, the one Dad intercepted. Never had the guts to destroy it completely, apparently." He looked away, uncomfortable with the admission. "I've read it. Explains a lot about what happened over there. Why Dave was so messed up when he came back. Why Dad was so desperate to keep him quiet." Mason stared at the envelope, suddenly heavy in his hands. "Thank you," he said simply. Tyler shrugged. "Doesn't change anything. Dad's still going to prison for a long time, but maybe it gives some closure about Dave." He hesitated before adding, "I'll be at the hearing tomorrow to support Shadow's placement with the kid. Figure I owe Dave and his dog that much, at least." After Tyler departed, Mason sat alone on the front steps, the unopened letter resting on his knees. Part of him wanted to tear it open immediately, to finally hear Dave's voice after all this time. Another part feared what truths might be contained within what horrors his friend had witnessed, what burdens he'd carried alone. Shadow found him there, padding silently around the corner of the house to sit beside him, the dog's warm flank pressing against Mason's leg in wordless companionship. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Mason murmured, resting a hand on Shadow's broad head. "About Dave, about Tommy, about all of it." Shadow's amber eyes met his, intelligent and steady. Mason had long since stopped being surprised by the depth of understanding he sometimes glimpsed there. The hearing the next day proceeded exactly as anticipated. The council chamber overflowed with Oakwood residents eager to witness the proceedings. Mrs. Landry occupied her promised front row seat, a container of homemade cookies open beside her. Dr. Marshall presented extensive documentation of Shadow's abilities as a seizure alert dog. Lieutenant Morrison testified about the dog's role in finding Ellie Thompson during the blizzard. Even Tyler Harmon spoke briefly, acknowledging his father's wrongdoing and supporting Shadow's placement with Tommy. When the vote came unanimous in favor of designating Shadow as a service animal and approving his permanent placement, the room erupted in applause. Tommy, who had sat quietly throughout the proceedings, broke into a rare, brilliant smile. Shadow, lying at the boy's feet throughout, merely thumped his tail once, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. The celebration afterward at Sarah's house took on the air of a community event, Neighbors brought dishes, children played in the yard under the spring sunshine, and Shadow patiently endured being the center of attention, accepting pats and treats with dignified tolerance. As evening approached and guests began departing, Mason found a quiet moment to speak with Mrs. Landry. The elderly woman sat watching Tommy and Shadow from a comfortable chair on the porch, her lined face peaceful. "Dave would be pleased," she said, as Mason settled beside her. "Seeing his shadow with that boy, it's right, somehow." "I think so, too," Mason agreed. "We found out they have a connection. Mark Wilson, Tommy's father, served with Dave briefly. They stayed in touch." Mrs. Landry nodded, unsurprised. "Dave mentioned him, said Mark was one of the good ones." She patted Mason's hand. "Like you. Dave always said you were one of the good ones, too." "I wish I could have helped him," Mason admitted, the familiar guilt surfacing. "If I'd known what he was going through." "You're helping now," Mrs. Landry interrupted gently. "With his dog, with that boy, with this town." Her rheumy eyes were wise with the perspective of age. "Sometimes the good we do comes after we're gone, through the people and things we loved. Dave loved that dog, something fierce. And now Shadow's doing good work Dave would be proud of." The simple wisdom of her words settled something in Mason's chest, not erasing the grief or regret, but placing it in a context he could live with. Later that night, after the last guests had gone and Tommy was asleep, Mason finally opened Dave's letter on Sarah's back porch. Shadow, a silent presence at his feet. Dave's familiar handwriting filled 5 pages, detailing the weapons trafficking he'd witnessed involving Tyler Harmon's unit, his internal struggle over reporting it, his eventual decision to keep silent for Tyler's sake but distance himself upon returning home. He described his deteriorating mental health, his growing reliance on Shadow, and his fear of Sheriff Harmon's escalating threats. "I'm reaching out because I don't know who else to trust." The letter concluded, "Shadow and I might need a place to stay for a while, just until I figure things out. I remember you mentioned your grandfather's cabin in Montana. Somewhere quiet to get my head straight would make all the difference. I hate asking, brother, but there's no one else." A request for sanctuary that had never arrived. A lifeline severed by Harmon's interference. Mason folded the letter carefully, a wave of fresh grief washing through him. Sarah found him there, tears tracking silently down his weathered face. Wordlessly, she sat beside him, her shoulder pressed against his in quiet support as Shadow laid his head across Mason's feet. "He just needed a safe place," Mason said finally, voice rough with emotion. "If I'd known." "You gave Shadow that safe place," Sarah reminded him gently, "and now he's giving it to Tommy." The observation was profound in its simplicity. The circle hadn't been broken, merely delayed, Dave's loyal companion fulfilling his protective purpose with a child who needed him, guided by whatever combination of training, instinct, and deeper connection had brought them together that day on Main Street. 6 weeks later, a moving truck sat in Sarah's driveway, loaded with the essential belongings of the Wilson household. The modest 3-bedroom house they'd found on the outskirts of Missoula waited for them, complete with the large fenced yard Mason had insisted upon for Shadow, and conveniently located between the Children's Hospital and the new K-9 training facility where Mason would begin work in July. Tommy supervised the final loading with unusual animation, ensuring his books and Shadow's bed were placed carefully among the boxes. Sarah worked through her meticulous checklist, confirming utilities were transferred and addresses changed. Mason secured Shadow's special harness, the official service dog vest emblazoned with medical alert patches that granted him access to accompany Tommy everywhere. Mrs. Landry arrived to say her goodbyes, pressing containers of cookies into Sarah's hands with strict instructions to call upon their arrival. Frank, from the VFW, presented Shadow with a custom dog tag engraved with his name and new official status. Dr. Marshall confirmed their first appointment at the neurology department in Missoula. As they prepared for departure, Tyler Harmon's truck pulled up. He approached cautiously, still uncertain of his welcome despite the gradual thawing of community resentment over the past months. "Wanted to say goodbye," he explained, hands shoved in his pockets in what Mason now recognized as a characteristic gesture of discomfort. "And to give you this?" He extended a small wooden box toward Tommy. It was Dave's. Found it when clearing Dad's storage unit. Thought Shadow might like to have it back. Inside the box lay a worn leather collar with military patches sewn onto it, Shadow's original K9 Corps collar. Tommy accepted it solemnly, showing it to Shadow, who sniffed it thoroughly, tail wagging in apparent recognition. "Thank you," Sarah said, genuine appreciation in her voice. "That's very thoughtful." Tyler nodded, awkward but sincere. "Good luck in Missoula. I hear it's nice there." As they finally pulled away, Sarah driving her car with Tommy and Shadow, Mason following in the truck. The boy twisted in his seat to wave goodbye to the neighbors gathered in the street. Shadow sat upright beside him, head held high, his posture alert and forward-facing as if already anticipating the new chapter awaiting them. In the rearview mirror, Sarah caught Mason's steady gaze from the truck behind them, his eyes reflecting the same quiet certainty she felt growing within herself. The road ahead curved toward the mountains, toward Missoula, toward a future none of them could have imagined a year earlier. Shadow had survived years as the feared ghost dog of Oakwood, scavenging from garbage, avoiding human contact. His remarkable abilities and training hidden beneath a skeletal frame and matted fur, Tommy had endured in his own silence, his potential limited by his condition and the absence of proper diagnosis. Mason had existed rather than lived, isolated in his grandfather's cabin with his unresolved grief and trauma. Sarah had carried on alone, doing her best for her son while keeping the rest of the world at a careful distance. Now the skeletal dog that had once terrified a town had become its unlikely hero, the catalyst for healing that extended far beyond his remarkable ability to detect seizures or find missing children. Through Shadow, connections had been restored, truth had emerged from darkness, and 4 wounded souls had found their way to each other. As they crossed the county line, leaving Oakwood behind, Sarah reached over to scratch Shadow behind his ears. The German shepherd leaned into her touch briefly before returning to his alert posture beside Tommy, ever watchful, ever protective. "Ready for our new adventure?" she asked, the question encompassing both her son and his 4-legged guardian. Tommy nodded, one hand resting on Shadow's thick fur. "Shadow says yes," he reported with the simple certainty of a child who had found his voice. "He says we're going home." In the warm spring sunlight streaming through the windows, Shadow's once dull coat gleamed with health and vitality, no longer the coat of a skeletal stray but of a dog who had found his purpose and, in doing so, had helped others find theirs as well. In our twilight years, we recognize life's most profound truth: it's never too late for redemption. Shadow's journey from a skeletal, feared stray to a beloved hero reminds us that our greatest chapters may still lie ahead. Like Mason, many of us carry invisible wounds from our past missed connections, undelivered messages, friends we couldn't save. Like Sarah, we've learned to build walls to protect what matters most. But this remarkable German Shepherd shows us that purpose doesn't diminish with age or hardship, it evolves. Shadow's military training, once used in war, found new meaning in saving Tommy, proving that our skills and experiences, even painful ones, prepare us for missions we cannot yet imagine. When Shadow stood between danger and those he loved, he embodied the courage we've shown throughout our lives as parents, veterans, and community members. His story touches us deeply because it reflects our own weathered by time and circumstance, yet still capable of extraordinary love and service. Remember, like Shadow, your scars don't define you, they reveal your strength. And sometimes, the most broken among us become the most beautiful when finally given the chance to fulfill their purpose.